You reach for it without even looking. Your hand already knows exactly where it is on the wall, and in less than 4 seconds the entire act is finished, forgotten, flushed away, and you move on with your day without a single conscious thought about what you just did. It is, statistically, one of the most repeated physical actions of your entire life, something you will do somewhere between 20 and 30,000 times before you die. And yet, it is also one of the least examined. So, here is the question nobody asks while they are sitting there scrolling their phone. What did human beings do for the other, roughly 190,000 years of our existence as a species, before a soft, perforated, cottony roll of paper became a birthright of modern life? The answer is not clean. It is not simple. And in more than one era of history, it was genuinely a matter of life and death, because the way a society dealt with human waste turned out to be one of the most powerful hidden forces shaping empires, plagues, wars, and the shape of cities themselves. Picture Rome in the 2nd century, at the height of its power, when the empire stretched from Britain to the Persian Gulf, and its public baths and aqueducts were considered engineering miracles that would not be equaled again for over 1,000 years. Even there, in the most sophisticated urban civilization the ancient world had ever produced, the communal latrines that lined the streets of cities like Ostia and Ephesus used a shared tool called the tersorium, a natural sea sponge fixed to the end of a short wooden stick, soaked in a bucket of salt water or sometimes vinegar, and passed from user to user along the stone bench. Historians and archaeologists who have studied the remains of these public latrines, with their rows of keyhole-shaped openings cut into marble or stone seating, note that dozens of strangers would sit side by side in the same room, chatting, doing business, even reciting poetry, while sharing this single communal sponge stick that was rinsed, at best, between uses. The Roman satirist Seneca wrote with dark humor about a gladiator who chose to end his own life using the very stick meant for that latrine sponge rather than face the arena. A detail so grim that historians still cite it as proof of how ordinary and unremarkable that object was. So common a household and public item that even in a moment of desperation it was simply within reach. Roman doctors of the era, including figures associated with the Hippocratic tradition, were already documenting outbreaks of dysentery and parasitic infection that swept through crowded barracks and city blocks. And while germ theory would not exist for another 17 centuries, the physical reality was brutally simple. Shared cleaning implements carried filth from one body to another with total efficiency. Move forward 1,000 years to medieval Europe, and the situation somehow becomes both cruder and more class-divided. In the crowded, muddy towns of the 12th and 13th centuries, from London to Paris to the Hanseatic ports of northern Germany, most ordinary people used whatever fibrous material was cheapest and most available, which usually meant handfuls of hay, straw, moss, or leaves, especially the broad, slightly fuzzy leaves of plants like mullein that peasants nicknamed, quite literally, cowboy toilet paper, centuries later when settlers found the same plant growing wild across the American frontier. In the depths of winter, when no leaves were available and moss froze solid, people resorted to corn cobs, wood shavings, or simply their bare hand, followed by a rinse in a nearby stream or a shared basin of water, a practice still used today in large parts of South Asia and the Middle East, where a small vessel of water known by names like lota or bidet shower is considered far more hygienic than dry paper ever could be. The wealthy fared somewhat better, though not by much in absolute terms. Members of European nobility and the emerging merchant class could afford softer materials, wool remnants, scraps of linen too worn for clothing, and eventually, once it became more common in the 14th and 15th centuries, discarded paper itself. Though paper at that time was a genuine luxury good, made by hand from pulped rags in small batches, expensive enough that using a whole sheet for something other than writing or printing would have seemed almost sinfully wasteful to most people. There is a famous, often repeated anecdote, likely embellished over centuries of retelling but rooted in real medieval attitudes toward luxury and waste, describing wealthy households in France using the soft down of geese, sometimes still attached to a live bird's neck for warmth and gentleness, an image so absurd and so telling of the lengths the rich would go to for basic comfort that it survived in folklore and was even referenced centuries later by the French writer François Rabelais in his satirical work Gargantua, where he lists dozens of increasingly ridiculous objects a character claims to have tried, goosenecks included, before concluding that nothing feels quite as pleasant. A joke that only worked because his readers understood exactly how universal and uncomfortable this daily problem really was. By the time paper became more industrially produced in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly after the invention of wood pulp-based papermaking in the 1840s by figures like the German inventor Friedrich Gottlob Keller, ordinary households in Europe and North America finally had access to cheap, disposable paper for the first time in history, but almost none of it was designed for the bathroom specifically. Instead, people used what was already sitting in the house, and the single most common source, by an overwhelming margin, was the mail order catalogue and the newspaper. The Sears, Roebuck and Company catalogue, first mailed out across rural America in the 1890s and growing into a doorstop-sized book of hundreds of pages by the turn of the century, became so associated with this secondary use that outhouses across the American Midwest and South kept it hanging from a string or nail specifically for that purpose, and there are documented complaints from the company itself in later decades that farmers were annoyed when Sears switched to glossy, coated paper stock for its pages sometime in the 1930s because the slicker paper was, in the blunt words of period newspaper columns commenting on the change, simply not fit for the job it had been quietly performing in millions of rural bathrooms for 40 years. This detail alone tells you something remarkable about how deeply embedded this improvised solution had become. So much so that a change in a mail order catalogue's paper quality generated genuine public grumbling. What nobody in those outhouses and tenement bathrooms realized was that a single man in New York City was already working, quietly and with almost no fanfare, on a solution that would eventually replace the catalogue entirely. His name was Joseph Gaiety, a modest entrepreneur and self-described medical product salesman, and in 1857 he introduced what is widely credited as the first commercially packaged toilet paper in the United States, sold in flat sheets rather than a roll, medicated with aloe extract and packaged in small boxes of about 500 sheets under the brand name Gaiety's Medicated Paper. He was so proud of the product and so convinced it represented a genuine medical breakthrough for preventing hemorrhoids and other ailments he associated with using newsprint that he had his own name printed on every single sheet, believing that personal branding would build the trust of skeptical customers. It did not work, at least not immediately. Gaiety's product struggled for decades, largely because it was priced far above what people were used to paying for something they could get for free from an old newspaper, roughly 50 cents for a box at a time when many laborers earned only $1 or $2 a day, and because there was, frankly, a significant taboo around openly discussing or purchasing a product explicitly marketed for this purpose. Store owners were reportedly reluctant to stock it prominently, and customers were embarrassed to ask for it by name, a social awkwardness that would haunt the entire toilet paper industry for the next 100 years and shape in strange ways how the product was eventually advertised. The real turning point, the moment that pushed this obscure product from a niche medical curiosity toward a genuine household necessity, came about 2 decades later and involved not one dramatic invention but a slow convergence of plumbing technology and public sanitation reform. In the 1880s and 1890s, flush toilets connected to indoor plumbing were spreading rapidly through American and British cities, driven in large part by the terrifying cholera epidemics that had ravaged London in 1854, famously traced by the physician John Snow to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street, an investigation now considered one of the founding moments of modern epidemiology. As cities scrambled to separate drinking water from sewage, and as engineers like Joseph Bazalgette built London's massive new sewer system in the 1860s at a cost of over £3 million, a staggering sum for the era, the entire infrastructure of daily bathroom habits shifted. And here was the catch that almost nobody anticipated. Newspaper, rags, corn cobs, and other traditional wiping materials that had worked fine when waste simply dropped into a pit or an open cesspool became a genuine engineering problem once toilets were connected to narrow ceramic pipes and delicate new sewer networks. Clogged pipes backed up sewage, and burst plumbing became common enough complaints that plumbers and city sanitation departments in both Britain and the United States began actively advising households to stop using anything except specially designed, quickly dissolving paper. This is exactly the gap that the Scott brothers, Elvin Clarence Scott and Elvin Ezra Scott of Philadelphia, walked into in 1879 when they founded the Scott Paper Company. Where Gaiety had tried to sell toilet paper as a medical product, the Scott brothers made a savvier bet. They partnered with local hotels, railroads, and eventually department stores to sell it as a plumbing and sanitation solution, positioning it as the paper that would not destroy your new indoor toilet the way newsprint could. Business boomed quietly through the 1880s and 1890s, though Scott Paper Company, still self-conscious about the taboo nature of the product, initially sold it under private labels for other companies rather than its own name, so that a hotel or business could stock it without customers necessarily associating the embarrassing product with a specific brand walking around town. It was not until 1902 that Scott began selling under its own name with any real confidence, and even then, advertising for bathroom tissue throughout the early 20th century remained almost comically indirect, full of euphemisms about softness and comfort with barely a mention of what the product was actually for, because newspapers themselves in that era frequently refused to run advertisements that used direct anatomical or bathroom language at all. If you are enjoying this walk through one of the strangest hidden histories of everyday life, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because there are dozens more stories just like this one. Ordinary objects sitting in your house right now that hide genuinely wild histories. And I would love to have you along for the next one. The cascade of consequences from this quiet paper revolution did not stop at plumbing. Once toilet paper became normalized as a mass-produced good in the first decades of the 20th century, it triggered a competitive arms race among manufacturers that reshaped the paper industry itself. Seth Wheeler, an inventor from Albany, New York, had already patented the idea of perforated rolled toilet paper back in 1891, a design so intuitive that it looks almost identical to what hangs in your bathroom today, complete with the now infamous and endlessly debated question of whether the roll should hang over or under, a debate whose earliest documented trace appears, remarkably, right there in Wheeler's own 1891 patent illustration, which clearly shows the paper hanging over the front of the roll, a detail that modern etiquette columns and internet arguments still cite as the original intended design more than a century later. By the 1920s and 1930s, competition between brands like Scott, Northern, and the newly formed Charmin, launched in 1928 by the Hoberg Paper Company in Green Bay, Wisconsin, turned softness itself into a marketing battlefield. Charmin's early advertising leaned so heavily into the idea of gentle, feminine softness that its very name was chosen specifically to evoke the word charming, and the company hired attractive spokesmodels for print ads decades before television. An odd but historically documented example of how a product nobody wanted to talk about openly still generated some of the most aggressive branding of the era. This branding arms race had a real economic effect too, pushing paper manufacturers to buy up vast tracts of forest land across the American South and the Pacific Northwest, specifically to guarantee pulp supply. a business decision that quietly reshaped logging industries and rural economies in states like Georgia, Wisconsin, and Oregon for the rest of the century. The next layer of the cascade reaches into public health in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. Once flush toilets and appropriately dissolving paper became standard across American and European cities through the early 20th century, urban death rates from waterborne diseases like typhoid fever and cholera collapsed dramatically. Public health historians studying American cities note that typhoid fever mortality rates, which had hovered above 100 deaths per 100,000 people in major cities like Chicago and Pittsburgh as late as the 1890s, fell by more than 90% within just a few decades of coordinated sewer expansion, clean water treatment, and the disappearance of improvised clog-prone waste materials from the plumbing system. This was not toilet paper. Acting alone, of course, chlorination of drinking water and filtration systems deserve enormous credit too. But sanitation engineers of the era were explicit in their reports that eliminating rags, corn cobs, and wads of newsprint from sewer lines was a necessary companion reform, because a functioning modern sewer system is really a single interconnected machine, and a clog in one household's pipe could back up an entire block's plumbing, creating exactly the kind of standing, contaminated water that mosquitoes and bacteria thrive in. There is also a darker, more unequal thread running through this entire story, one that reveals just how much access to something as simple as a soft roll of paper has historically tracked with wealth, race, and geography. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, toilet paper remained a real household expense that struggling families sometimes cut in favor of food. And the old habit of using mail-order catalog pages or newspaper persisted heavily in poorer rural communities and among sharecropper families across the American South well into the 1940s. In parts of the segregated South, black families systematically denied access to the same wages, credit, and retail infrastructure as their white neighbors were documented by oral historians and Works Progress Administration interviewers in the 1930s as relying on catalog pages and corn shucks far longer than the mainstream marketing of companies like Scott & Chalmer would ever suggest. A quiet but real illustration of how a product marketed as a universal modern comfort was, in practice, distributed along the same unequal lines as almost everything else in that era. Globally, the divide was even starker. In large parts of colonial era, Africa and Asia under British, French, and Dutch rule through the early 20th century, indigenous populations were rarely provided with the same sanitation infrastructure being built for European colonial administrators and settlers, meaning that entire cities developed on a two-tiered system: flush toilets and imported paper products for colonial elites, and traditional water-based or improvised cleaning methods for everyone else. A disparity that public health researchers have directly linked to disproportionately higher rates of cholera and dysentery outbreaks in colonized populations well into the 20th century. World War II added its own strange chapter to this story. Paper, like rubber and metal, became a rationed and strategically managed material in both the United States and Britain between 1942 and 1945, and toilet paper specifically was affected by shortages of both raw pulp and the manpower needed to run paper mills at full capacity, since so many young workers had been drafted into military service. British households were officially encouraged by government pamphlets to use newspaper again during the height of wartime shortages, reviving a habit many had only recently abandoned, while American manufacturers like Scott Paper temporarily redirected significant portions of their production capacity toward military uses, including the specialized, waterproof, treated paper needed for ammunition packaging and field first aid supplies. Meaning that in a very literal sense, the same company and often the same machinery that made bathroom tissue for American homes were, for a few critical years, helping supply materials for soldiers fighting across Europe and the Pacific. Perhaps the most bizarre and genuinely fascinating chapter of the entire toilet paper story, though, is the one that unfolded decades later and had nothing to do with an actual shortage at all. In December of 1973, the American television host Johnny Carson, during a monologue joke on his enormously popular late-night program The Tonight Show, mentioned that there was a shortage of toilet paper developing in the United States, a claim loosely inspired by a real but relatively minor supply hiccup reported by a Wisconsin congressman named Harold Froelich, who had noted that the federal government's own paper procurement bids were coming in lower than expected due to a temporary pulp shortage tied to broader 1970s inflation and the oil crisis affecting manufacturing costs across many industries. Carson's joke, delivered to an audience of an estimated 20 million viewers, was meant purely as a punchline, but the psychological effect was almost instantaneous and completely disproportionate to reality. Within 24 hours, grocery stores and supermarkets across the country reported customers buying up entire shelves of toilet paper in a genuine consumer panic, with some stores instituting purchase limits of 1 or 2 packages per customer within days, and news footage from that period, still occasionally rebroadcast today, shows shoppers wheeling out carts stacked shoulder-high with rolls, physically fighting the very shortage that their own panic buying was actively creating. Scott Paper Company and other manufacturers were reportedly baffled, since their production numbers showed no actual supply crisis at all before the panic began, meaning that an offhand joke from a television host manufactured a real, physical, weeks-long shortage purely through the psychological mechanism of a run on a product, a phenomenon economists would study for decades afterward as a textbook case of a self-fulfilling prophecy in consumer behavior. It is almost impossible not to notice the eerie echo of this exact same pattern repeating itself in March of 2020, when the emerging COVID-19 pandemic triggered a nearly identical global wave of toilet paper panic buying, with stores from Sydney to London to Los Angeles reporting bare shelves and even, in a few widely photographed Australian incidents, physical altercations between shoppers over the last remaining packages, despite manufacturers again confirming there was no actual supply chain collapse behind it, only anxiety, uncertainty, and a strange collective instinct to hoard the one product that had, by pure historical accident, become the world's default symbol of basic bodily dignity and control in the face of chaos. There is something genuinely moving buried underneath all these statistics and marketing wars, and it shows up most clearly in the small, human-scale stories that survive from oral histories of the era before toilet paper was universal. Elderly interview subjects recorded by rural history projects across the American Midwest and South in the 1970s and 1980s, describing their childhoods in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, consistently bring up two things unprompted: the genuine physical discomfort and occasional infection risk of using corn cobs or coarse paper in the outhouse, the strange, almost universal shared embarrassment of a household running out entirely and having to borrow from a neighbor, a small transaction of quiet mutual aid that many describe with surprising tenderness decades later, remembering it not as humiliating, but as a genuine expression of rural community bonds, where nobody judged you for the request, because everyone had been in the exact same position themselves at some point. That small human detail captures something the corporate advertising and public health statistics never quite reach: the way something as unglamorous as bathroom hygiene was, for most of human history, a shared vulnerability that connected people across a street or a village, rather than the private, silent, individual act it has become behind the closed bathroom doors of the modern world. The transformation from communal sponge sticks in ancient Rome to individually wrapped, ultra-soft, quilted rolls stocked in every corner store today did not happen because someone sat down and decided to solve bathroom hygiene as an isolated problem. It happened as an accidental byproduct of plumbing engineering, wartime paper rationing, aggressive 20th century advertising battles between rival companies desperate to make their toilet paper feel softer than a competitor's, and even, strangely enough, A single joke told on a late-night television show in 1973 that briefly convinced an entire nation there was nothing left on the shelves. Each of these threads, sanitation reform, industrial capitalism, wartime scarcity, and pure herd psychology, wove together into the object now sitting quietly in your bathroom cabinet, restocked without a second thought, used without a flicker of conscious gratitude, and yet representing the end point of literally thousands of years of humanity, slowly, painfully, unevenly, solving one of its most basic and universal problems. So the next time you reach for that roll without even looking, hand moving automatically to the exact spot on the wall where it always is, take one extra half second to actually notice it. That soft, unremarkable object represents the collapse of cholera epidemics that once killed tens of thousands of people in a single European city within a matter of weeks. It represents a Philadelphia entrepreneur named Joseph Gayety, putting his own name on every single sheet of paper in 1857, betting his reputation on a product nobody wanted to admit they needed. It represents Roman gladiators, medieval peasants gathering mullein leaves along muddy roadsides, sharecropper families thumbing through worn-out mail-order catalogs by lamplight, and 20 million American television viewers laughing at a joke in December of 1973 that would somehow trigger a genuine national shortage within a single day. An object so mundane you have probably never spent more than 2 seconds thinking about it in your entire life turns out to be carrying one of the strangest, most quietly consequential threads running through the entire history of human civilization. Sanitation, class, war, marketing, and pure collective psychology all rolled, quite literally, into one soft little cylinder sitting on the edge of your bathtub right now. If this kind of hidden history behind an everyday object is the kind of thing that fascinates you the way it fascinates me, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel, because this is exactly the rabbit hole we go down every single time, taking something you have touched 1,000 times without thinking and showing you the strange, surprising, sometimes brutal story hiding underneath it. There are so many more of these waiting, so stick around and I will see you in the next one.